So this is where the journey begins. This is the CSI number 1. This is the very beginning of the maturity model for marketing automation. If you want to maximize Pardot, it all starts here. This is the webinar associated with the beginning of it all. And really, what do we do in the beginning? What do you need to do in the beginning? You need to better understand your buyers, better understand your customers. And then once you do that, you can then translate that into better segmenting them in Pardot, better categorizing them and putting them into the right list. So you're not just emailing everyone at the same time. All right. Welcome, welcome. Look at that. I just changed the channel on you there. How many people, and if you haven't been to one of these webinars before, this is interactive. So definitely throw in the chat, throw in the GoToMeeting. If you're on one of the webinars where I gave up my cell phone, you can text me the answer. How many of you have seen the Newlywed Game, whether in its earliest existence or in a modern remake? How many of you have seen that? If you have, go ahead and say, I have, or some smiley face in the chat. And what that does is that just makes it more fun for you, more fun for me. And what you'll find out in this is not your standard webinar. This is like fun time. So we're going to have fun here today. We're going to learn about our buyers, learn about segmentation. I see a lot of people saying, yes, if you haven't, it's probably worth going and hitting up YouTube, maybe after work, maybe during work, just to get a sense for it. We're going to talk about it. But before we get to the game, I want to introduce your fabulous host. So there I am in my three-piece suit from the 70s. And so if you haven't met me already, my name is Casey Cheshire. Very excited to be here, founder of Cheshire Impact. And I'm also the company's CMO. So I am focused on marketing, longtime marketer. And those 3 numbers next to my name, some of you will know what those stand for. If you don't, I'm going to tell you. 10, that's the number of years I've worked with marketing automation and with Pardot. I've been marketing a long time before that, but that's the time I've been around marketing automation, and I love marketing automation. So if you don't know me yet, you know that I love marketing automation. And I see some hands, I see all sorts of interactions. That's great. Keep it up. 2,300, that's the number of Pardot implementations Cheshire Impact has done. That doesn't even count all the clients we've worked with on an ongoing basis. So all that means is experience. We've seen what works personally and also what works across the board. So we're here to share what works, what doesn't work, and how to address that with both the strategies and also then deep dive into Pardot. 32 is a number of skydives that I've done, and I'm happy to report that I recently got trained last Saturday again. So I'm all trained up. So as soon as the sky is blue and not gray like it is today in New Hampshire, I will be adding something to that number. So for those of you who have seen that 32 there for too long, I'm going to make that 33 and beyond. And we'll talk about Cheshire Impact later, but let's get into it. Welcome to the Newlywed Game. Go ahead and pick up your Quizzo clickers, which is the chat menu here for Pardot, and go ahead in the chat menu. I have a couple questions for you. What is the best industry for your company? So if you're looking at the different buyers and the different people out there, who are the best buyers? Is there a particular industry that just is a sweet fit for your company? And also, while you're go ahead and share that in the chat too. And if there is also maybe not a best industry, but is there a best role? The perfect person you want to be introduced to. Do you want to meet the CMO? Do you want to meet the head of IT? Who would you like to connect to? Go ahead and throw those in the chat. Okay, great. That's interesting. Education. That's a great industry. And while you're throwing these in there, let me introduce to you the Newlywed Game. What this TV show is all about, I know some of you have seen it in the past, they take 2 couples that just got married and they want to have them answer questions about each other. So they'll send away one half and then the other half will be on stage and they'll ask them questions like, what's their favorite color? What's their favorite ice cream? What would happen if this scenario occurred? What would your significant other do? Right? They ask them all these questions, and then they come back, and then they ask the spouse, the newlywed, what did your person say? Or what do you think your person said? Try to match their answers. And you would not believe the craziness that happens on this show. We think we know someone. In this case, these people have actually decided to get married, and yet what you find, and the reason this show is so funny, is that we realize we really don't know too much about each other, especially when a quiz show is asking us questions on national TV. So, all right, so I see some nonprofits. So another question for you to answer in the chat. Do you know your buyer's biggest pain point? If you do, you could say yes. If you actually know what that pain point is, you could even just type it. But what is the biggest pain point of your buyer? Those industries or those roles or titles that you're going after. What are the biggest pain points they're experiencing? Or do you even know them? If you don't feel like typing because you're in that beanbag and it's comfortable, totally get it. Go throw a quick yes in the chat if you know. If you don't know, that's okay too. Say no if you're not sure. Finally, does that person you're talking about with that role and that title that you're looking for, do they own the budget or someone else? Do they have to get approval from someone, or does someone else have to do that for them? These are some questions about our buyers, and I wonder how we would do if we were in the newlywed game with our buyer, with our best buyer, ideal customer profile. Finally, how many facts do your buyers need before they make a decision? Go ahead and throw a number in there, or throw a lot or little. Do you even know? There's different kinds of buyers. Some actually do a lot of research, a lot of fact finding, and some don't. Some just kind of pull the trigger. And it tends to tie into the role and title of someone in their company. So go ahead and throw that kind of stuff in the chat, and we'll take a look at it. But let's continue on. How did we do? And just think about it. Whether you shared it in the chat or not, how did you do for this quiz? Did you have an idea on pretty much every one of the questions? Or no? I get some people saying yes, some people saying they have a good sense of what they were looking at, some people not so much. Now here's the question: how much of this was gut, like a gut feeling? Like maybe you think you know, and yeah, definitely not for all. Some say yes, impact metrics are important for nonprofits. Now the question is, these answers, do they come from talking to your buyer? Do they come from surveys? Or is it just kind of your gut? I've been in this position in the past where I think I know what our buyers are thinking of. And sometimes when they're in the same industry, like if you're a marketer selling to marketers, that can be a little easier because you might be right, but you might not be. And it can be even crazier if you're selling to a completely different industry, like a marketer creating assets for someone in the IT space, especially if you've never been in IT. It can be really hard to understand what they're thinking. And so this whole webinar is all about this most neglected aspect of marketing. It's our buyer. It's crazy to think about. Why? So much of our day gets taken up thinking about, okay, what's the correct tactical feature on Pardot to make this thing happen? And we're going to talk about that. But that's not where you go first. The first thing we need to think about is, do we actually know these people, right? These people that we want to shell out lots of money to buy our product or service, do we even know what they're thinking about? And I got to tell you, the more research you do into your buyer, we'll talk about the different ways coming up. The more research you do, first of all, the better you'll do in the newlywed game if it ever happens. But second of all, it actually gives a stronger purpose, right? So too often, and I've been here too, where you look at, it could be a Pardot report and has a bunch of numbers on it, and you're thinking, oh, okay, I'd like those numbers to increase, or that's a good number set. Those numbers are actually people behind the scenes. And so it's helpful to just pause for a second to think, okay, there are people behind these scenes, and maybe even know what their names are and know what their struggles are, because then no longer are you just trying to manipulate numbers on a screen, you're actually trying to help people. And I got to tell you, that makes marketing way more fun. You'll have fun looking at reports in the middle of the night because you want to actually improve things and help these people out. So if you can tie into that, all the better. And I will say finally, there is some confusion in the thought leadership space. There's some apps out there and some SaaS products that put out some crazy things in terms of what you should or shouldn't know about your buyer. And it kind of muddles the water for everyone. I know for about the first half of my marketing career, I kind of was thinking the wrong thing. I was a little confused on this. It wasn't until I talked to an expert in the industry where I really got my mind shifted. So we're going to correct all these thoughts tonight. But don't worry, judgment free. If you were doing it the wrong way, or if you just weren't doing it all, it's all good. We're going to fix it here. And this is the start of that journey of maximizing marketing automation, is this webinar. And what does it look like to win? Here's some stats. So just a few stats for you. Things are increasing, right? It's all green. If you can win that game, win that newlywed game. By the way, if you win that contest, they actually they pay for your honeymoon if you win the newlywed game. So it's a pretty sweet deal. Well, if you win knowing your buyer, there is so much more that's going to happen. And so this is why we put this at the very beginning of this maturity model, which we're going to talk about. We put it at the very beginning because if you do these things, if you're personalizing emails, if you're segmenting your campaigns, you're going to get way more engagement. And then even down the line, when it comes to giving leads to sales, they're going to get better leads out of it. They're going to convert more of the leads out of it. Revenue increases. Finally, you get grandma on the dance floor. Magic happens when you are thinking about your buyer and then putting them in the right section and then marketing to them individually. So let's talk about this. Today's schedule. We've been talking a little bit about why this, right? Why it's important. Why should we be here? Because you get so many things out of it. And then the work you do now, it will not be wasted. It'll pay off on every other step in this process. Why now is what we're going to talk about next. Then we're going to just break down simply what is segmentation. It probably is what you think it is, but there's some confusion around buyer personas and buyer profiles. Most of what people say are buyer personas are actually buyer profiles. And so we're going to smash that myth, if you will. Finally, we're going to talk about how do you research your buyers. The answer is very simply, you talk to them. And I know that can make us all kind of shy, so I'm going to talk about the ways that we can approach those phone calls and can approach those conversations. Finally, we'll talk about some segmentation planning, really down-to-earth segmentation planning, not this like pie in the sky, okay, you need 12 segments and here's all this stuff and you can't send another campaign out for 9 months. No. We're going to really get to like, what can you do now? What can you do to the end of this webinar to really just make a difference? Finally, we'll dive into Pardot list hacks. This may be a review for some people, and you may just find a couple tidbits in there in terms of what are the different kinds of lists you can do, the different ways you can segment in Pardot, and what are the ones that are just completely almost useless, and which ones, when should you use a static list versus a dynamic list? If you already know that, great. But there is a couple things in there, and what you really don't want to do is cross the boundary between the two. So we're going to dive into that. And then finally, we will talk about resources. We've done so much research. I've talked to so many amazing people on the podcast about this very topic. It's fantastic. We're going to share all of that with you today. So today's quiz show is sponsored by Total CSI. The CSI, the Cheshire Success Index, if you haven't heard about this, it is a maturity model for marketing automation. And yes, it's on the cereal box right here, but what it actually is 10 essential steps for maximizing marketing automation. So what should you do first? What should you do second, third, fourth, fifth? And the reason we created this is because I've experienced this. You get Pardot, you've implemented it, or you've inherited it from someone, and you finally get to understand the tool. You realize there's 80,000 things you can do with it. I think we did the math on another webinar where we multiplied all the, I think there's like 300 different navigational sections in Pardot, and there's all these different features you can do. There's like a couple 100,000 things you can do with Pardot. So the question is then, what should you do first? Just like in the finance world when they're saying, well, should I pay off a credit card or the student loan or the mortgage or invest in my 401k? What should I do first? That's a challenging question, right? So what should you do first? Same thing in marketing automation. There is an order to this chaos. So we've created it. And again, all the collective experiences. And so it's 10 steps, but there's also a quiz associated with it. Quiz show, assessment. And so each one of those steps has a question associated with it. And what we do is we actually go through those questions and ask you, hey, are you doing such and such and such? And if you're doing it, you get a point. If you're not doing it, then it's 0. And then there's also partial credit. And the result is you get a number that tells you exactly how well you're using Pardot. And so we mentioned gut feel earlier. A lot of times we have this gut feel with Pardot. It's like, well, I probably could use it a little bit better. I really like to. I just don't have time, right? But you're not really sure how well you're using it. You're going to have a number to tell you. Now, that might sound scary, and it can be, but the good news is at least you then know, right? At least, hey, if you're 2 out of 10, okay, you're 2 out of 10. Let's make it a 3 and then a 4 and then a 5. And then when you go from a 2 to a 4, you just doubled your use of marketing automation. So those thousands of dollars you're spending on Pardot, you can then go report back and say, I've doubled our effectiveness with Pardot. Here's how, and here's what we did. That's why we have it. We also have it because you're going to have what's your next step. You do these things in order. And here's a picture, not really a quiz show, but this is the one side that shows the Cheshire Success Index. I call it the CSI, the acronym way too good to pass up. And you'll notice there's different phases and different steps, almost like you're climbing a mountain. And in that first phase, we've got segmentation and knowing your buyer. That's what we're talking about today. And then after we get that nailed, we want to talk about ROI tracking, first touch tracking, and then data preparedness. And then from there, we talk about creating gated content and then multiple nurtures. And so we go and we progress onward. And so what this does, though, is after we do the CSI together, and we're not going to do the CSI today. What we do that separate. We don't do it on a webinar. We do it individually with you because it's like a question answer type of thing. And so we go back and forth. It takes 30 minutes. And if you're interested, if you don't have a score, then all you need to do is type in CSI in the chat, and we'll follow up with you afterward to schedule a time to do the CSI together. And again, you'll get that score, you'll get that number. It's the next step. All you got to do is type CSI, or you can even type it in the question interface, CSI, and we'll follow up with you. So it's pretty cool, right? You don't have to click something and fill out a form. You just have to type something. Or you could raise your hand, but actually better if you could type because then the hands go down sometimes. All right, so we're on phase 1, number 1 right now. And what you'll find, though, is when you go through the CSI, you'll end up with a score. You might have some points here, might some points there, might some points here. And your very first step is to go back to your first incomplete number. So let's say you're like, well, I'm doing some segmentation, but it could be better. It's not fully there. Perfect. The work you put in on number 1, it'll never be a waste of time, I promise you. So let's get into what number 1 is. And again, they all have a question associated with them. And when we do the CSI call together, we're going to go through these questions together, figure out together what your overall score is. And then we're going to track it, and we're going to encourage you. And then there's webinars in each and every step. There's worksheets and templates on each and every step. So we're here to support you. We want to make you a hero in this process. So for CSI number 1, do you send targeted emails to prospects? And go ahead and answer this in the chat too. Do you send targeted emails to prospects based on information from both marketing automation and CRM? And so to break that down, because I know it's like a meaty sentence. By the way, great to see a couple people putting they want a CSI in there. Perfect. We will hook you up. And so for number 1, though, if you're listening and you're thinking about your own marketing, the question is, do you send targeted emails from prospects with information in marketing automation and CRM? And so I'll break that down. The first part is, do you send targeted emails? Meaning, do you send to everyone at the same time? Or do you have separate lists for different groups? And I know it sounds basic, and I know it sounds like, well, of course I do, Casey, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you might be busy, whatever reason, you might be emailing all of your prospects all at the same time. Now, it's great if you're not emailing your future buyers and your current customers at the same time. But what I'm focusing on here is your prospects, your future buyers. Do you email them all in one big blast, or do you have separate emails that go out to the separate types of buyers? If they're separate, that's good, and that's a yes. If not, then that's something we're going to work on today. And then the final part is, are you using information from both marketing automation and CRM? That would mean, yes, you're using information in Pardot, things like their role or maybe their industry. And then the other thing would be, are you using the opportunity status? Where is sales at with someone? If they have an open opportunity, maybe you shift your nurture campaign. If they don't have an open opportunity yet, or maybe they have a closed lost opportunity, they didn't buy for whatever reason, you could then use that information to dynamically put them on a separate list and maybe win them back in a year if they went with the competition. So there's all kind of things you can do. Now, if you're fully doing this whole question, that's a yes, and you get 1 point on CSI number 1. If it's a no, you give yourself a 0. Yeah, if you're somewhat doing it, give yourself a partial credit, and that's a 0.5. And you see, this is the process we go through with each one of these CSI steps. Cool. So important to get your CSI score. It looks like some of us are doing it. Some have separate. Some are not doing it. That's okay. That's what we're here to talk about. And really what segmentation is, sometimes the best way to get at this is just looking at a Wikipedia or like a definition on a dictionary. By the way, Nick, I see your comment. We'll take care of it. We'll chat soon. No problem. And you can even listen to the recording. So when we talk about segmentation, we're talking about dividing up a market of customers into groups or segments based on different characteristics. Can't get more basic than that. We just don't want to email everyone at the same time. Imagine talking to someone who's the head of sales the same way you talk to someone who's the head of IT. They dress differently, they act differently, they have different pain points, they stay up in different hours of the day. There's all sorts of differences. But imagine talking to them at the same time. Well, it is mildly effective. But when you separate them into separate groups and email them individually, that's when you get all those amazing numbers we saw earlier in the day. That's where those come from. So that's what we're trying to address here. Real question for everyone. Does anyone know, or has anyone ever done buyer profiles or buyer personas, or even heard of them? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. Have you heard of buyer personas? Have you heard of buyer profiles? Do you have them? Do you want them? Do you not like them? What have you seen? Go ahead and throw that in the chat. Okay, some people have heard of both of them. Some have heard of personas. I know I'd heard of personas. Okay, yep, someone else? Yes, heard of you and used both. Awesome. Great to hear you've used both. That's so interesting because sometimes what happens, and I mentioned this earlier at the beginning, and Adele Ravella said this in an interview with me on the podcast. She said most of what passes as buyer personas these days is actually a buyer profile. And it's really important to separate out the two. And I gotta be honest, until I talk to the wizard herself, right? Until I talked to Adele, and she basically, and if you ever listen to the podcast, and I'll point you to which one it is, you can actually hear me untwisting my brain on this podcast where I had been confused about these two things for most of my marketing career until I talked to her about it. So let's dive into what they are. And a little shout out to HubSpot, who likes to confuse us with what some people may call a buyer persona, but it's actually a profile. So a buyer profile is like what you're looking at here. It's very much like an FBI bad guy profile. What it's doing is it's highlighting characteristics of someone. It might be their nickname, Sample Sally, or the Jackrabbit John Dillinger, right? So it's giving some information, some background about people, potentially some demographics, and it's some other things that might be helpful. Now they can go a little crazy, and they can talk about, oh, do they like dogs? Do they like cats? Do they prefer cheese on their French fries? Do they like poutine from Canada? Like, you can go a little crazy with this. And then what Adele challenged me with is, okay, what do you do with this? Once you have a buyer profile, what do you do with this? I think it could be really helpful to put a face to a name, because what that does is it kind of, again, it gets us out of treating our customers like numbers. So I dig that. I also like the idea that we're thinking about what kind of demographics or characteristics make up our buyer, because maybe it's something we can segment and part on. Okay, marketing manager versus VP of marketing versus the head of sales. We want to treat them differently, so we're going to segment them differently. Perfect. Okay, but some of these other things, but you can segment them differently. But then what do you do with that segment, right? So that's where the buyer personas come in. And so profile, it's not all bad, it's not terrible. We mentioned a couple of things. It already gets people getting us thinking about them as people. We can use it. They're actually great for AdWords and Facebook advertising because it tells you some things you might want to put in there and look up. But it falls short because then the real question is like, okay, what action do you take? What kind of content do you create for them? They're a marketer. Great. Okay, they like cats. Okay, so what do we do next? That's where the persona comes in. So let's talk about that. The persona, very important. It's an actionable document that actually reveals insights about your buyers, decisions, and the specific attitudes, concerns, criteria they have. So I don't know if you can zoom in on this one over here, but this is much more interesting. And really, a persona is the path they took to make that purchase, right? So a profile might be a snapshot on who a lot of them are. Okay, they're this particular role, this particular industry. Okay, great. But the persona is the way in which they buy. And what's very cool about personas, and for those of you that are using both, that's fantastic, because you very often will have only a few personas, but you'll often have a ton of profiles. So when we get too focused on profiles, you might have to make 12 of them to really cover the different types of people. But when you start doing persona work, what you'll find is that you only maybe have one or two personas there. Oh, okay, this is a good zoom in. So really interesting story. Adele Ravelli, when she was doing buyer persona research with John Deere, the tractor people, when they're doing these B2B commercial sales of some heavy duty equipment, they were in something like, all the geographies. So like, I don't know, 12 different geos around the world, specifically identified several industries, not just manufacturing and construction, but also some services organizations. So they're selling this particular kind of equipment to a lot of different businesses. If they were to go the standard profile approach, they would have to make a drip campaign for each one, right? We just talked about how we have to make a separate segment and drip campaign for different types of buyers. If we go off of profiles, you've got a lot of work to do. You've got to make a lot of these things and send out 12 different versions of the email. But she did some buyer persona research. Come to find out, that particular equipment business that she was working with only had 2 buyer personas, right? So then all these geographies, all these different types of people making purchases, but the way that they made their purchases only followed 2 major paths. And she discovered this by talking to many of them. And over a series of conversations, she's like, okay, this person fits in that category again. That path, this person follows this path. And one of them was a very educated buyer who was like, give me a comparison chart and definitely don't call me. And the other one said, I don't really know what I'm doing here. Can I please talk to someone right now? And do you have any examples of how I could grow my business with this, right? 2 very different approaches in multiple geographies, multiple languages, different types of businesses and industries, but it was 2 similar paths. And they actually use dynamic content to cover the rest. So that's really the thought you want to take. And to get buyer personas, we need to know more than just, okay, who is this person? What demographics do they fit? Something that you can maybe get off of a list buy. It's a little deeper than that. And so what we're going to talk about here is how to actually learn about our buyers. All right, so it's all done in what's called a buyer interview. And the challenge is it doesn't really work off of a survey. Surveys ask the first question. What you really want to see is the second question or the follow-on question. So it's like, take me back to when you realized you needed a solution. And the person says, well, I did such and such. And then the follow-on question is, well, tell me more about that. Or what made you do what you just described? Or why did you take that path? And that's where some of these different things materialize. And so these buyer interviews are fantastic. And it really takes the bite out of what you might see in a survey, because surveys are great. They give you that starting question, perhaps, like, oh, this is a trend. But it's in like, okay, why is that a trend? Why is this happening? Oh, you hate when someone calls you on the phone. Why is this? Oh, because you've done this before. Got it. We're treating you like a newbie. Okay, interesting. So it's those follow-on questions that happen. And I get it. We can get kind of nervous when we're talking about you need to talk to your buyer. Well, you do. And so it can be helpful to be someone not connected to it. So for sure, you don't want the sales rep that did or didn't sell the deal or is going to call them or already talk to them to be the one doing this research. Marketing can be a good way of doing it. Sometimes third parties, and there's actually a couple we'll point you to in the resources that are fantastic at this. They'll call both the customers that bought from you and the customers that didn't buy from you in like a double approach research and ask them the same kind of questions. Either way, whether you do it or someone else does it, the way you go is you go back to that question I said at the beginning. Take me back to when you realized you needed a solution or when you had a problem or you realized there was an issue. Because what we're doing is we're going back to the very beginning of their buyer's journey. We're literally getting them to reveal their buyer's journey to us through a conversation, noting every different step of it. Okay, so that's when you realize there was an issue. Awareness, that would often fall into the awareness category. Well, when people start shopping, and you're going to ask them, okay, well tell me about the different products or different services you evaluated. Obviously you evaluated ours, you evaluated someone else's. What was in your mind when you're looking at different solutions? What did you want to see from the one that you went with in the end? And what was most important to you? Because oftentimes what happens is the things that we think are important in the sales process. Hey, did you know we have a money back guarantee? Or did you know that, you get a free iPad with every purchase? Some of these things that we think are important may not be important to the buyer or to a particular buyer persona. And I think so many times if you just talk to one or two or just a couple samples, different couple customers, you might hear some weird information like, oh no, I really don't like that at all. Really don't like that at all. Really don't like that at all. And then you remove that thing. But guess what? Maybe another persona really did like that thing. So that's why you need at least 20 is the rule of thumb in terms of your buyer interviews. And I get it. It may take a little bit of time to schedule them, but you want to get started now because the information you're going to get from them is going to be amazing. And that's what goes into a persona. Because with a persona now, you know exactly what you need to do. Well, this buyer loves comparison charts. And they were telling me one of the reasons they chose us is because we gave them the information quickly and they didn't have to, dance around like they'd never done this before. Great. Okay, let's make sure we create more content like that. Or this other person is new or they followed this other persona path. And so we want to make sure we can answer these different questions that came up in our conversation along the way, right? So when you do the buyer interviews, it's not just, again, to make another piece of paper called a persona or a profile. It gives you a whole laundry list of projects you can then undertake, nurture campaigns you can create, emails and landing pages, and all the things you're going to create later on in the CSI, all the things you're going to do anyways in your job. This is going to give you that list of amazing things to do. All right, so how do you approach this? What's the common way of approaching this where you don't lose your mind? And understanding that of course, you've got jobs to do still. It's not like you can stop everything and learn about your buyer. Though I might argue and even wager that that'd probably be worth it if you're not very aware of your customers. I talked to some amazing CMOs on the podcast, and one of the first things they all do when they get to a new company is they ask questions. Ask questions of their current buyers, of future buyers. They ask questions of employees, of team members, of leadership, asking questions. And so if you can take some time out or carve it in different parts of your day throughout the week, it's going to be worth it. So the way you start this whole thing out is really thinking back to that the CSI requirement, that question we want to answer. We want to get a full point on that question. That's the goal, right? And if we follow this roadmap, it's going to take care of us. So really what we're looking to do is send targeted emails. So to do that, we're not hitting everyone at the same time. So first step is to acknowledge and index what we currently have. What do we currently have for lists? This goes great on an Excel doc or Google Sheet. The idea is, what are we currently using? Do we have a current, all customer list? Do we have an all partner list? Have we done any industry segmentation? Do we have industry segmentation? Does it even matter yet? I don't know, but let's take an index of what you have to begin with. And from there, you then start with your largest two profiles. When it comes to building out drip campaigns and all these other things, start with your largest two. Marketing managers, marketing VPs, or maybe it might be the marketing team and the sales team, or it might be IT asset managers and IT service managers, or whatever the two largest groups are. You take your total group and split it into two. Or it might be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but what are the two biggest ones? Take those two, and that's where you're going to start building your nurtures around. And really, if you're going to send an email out to everyone, break off these largest two groups to send them targeted emails. And see, that way you're not creating too much work for yourself. I don't want to make you go from sending 1 email or 2 emails to like 12 or 11. Right, but we do want to get targeted because that's where all those juicy results come from, is those targeted emails. And you're going to start building nurtures around them. You do that, and as you're doing that, you begin your buyer persona research, acknowledging it's not going to be quick. It's not going to, you get it done in a day. You got to schedule time with your clients and customers and agree what are good ones to talk to. But you want to get at least started in that planning. Next, I don't know if anyone here has worked with Susan. Go ahead and give a shout out to Susan if you've ever worked with her. She's fantastic. She's one of our senior consultants here, and she actually has a workshop. It's a segmentation and nurturing workshop. It's fantastic. I've sat through several of them. Amazing. What they do is they're designed to go through different questions and actually help you create. What we can't necessarily do sweeping through in an hour on a webinar. Susan sits down with you and you go through worksheets and you go through questions. And oftentimes, we actually do this internally. So we actually do the CSI ourselves, and we're constantly trying to raise our CSI score. And we did this internally. And sometimes from these workshops, you come out of it with just more questions than answers, but then you go do the research and get the answers, and you build out those profiles, build out the personas, and then you work on what kind of engagement you want to do with the different groups. And you come out of it with templates. By the way, Hardcore Marketing, episode 25. We'll talk more about the podcast if you're not aware of it. Episode 25, Susan's on there, and she basically just reveals all of her methodology for this whole workshop. So that's available if you're currently working with Cheshire Impact. All you have to do is just ask for that kind of a workshop. Otherwise, check her out on number 25. All right, let's dive into Par.Tech time. Then from there, we'll do some resources, and then let's do some Q&A. And if you haven't thought of one yet, think of a question, any kind of crazy question, and throw those out at the end, and it'll be fun. So let's get into Par.Tech. If you're a seasoned, experienced Par.Pro, you probably are familiar with the different kinds of lists you can do. And whether you're certified or not, it's something you're going to want to clarify on, because these things definitely come up in the 2 different levels of certification for Par.Pro, depending on what question set you get. But questions around these definitely come up, especially even the words that get used. So first of all, let's talk about static lists. There's static lists, there's dynamic lists, and there's this other thing that is there that you don't typically use very often, but we'll highlight it. So static lists don't really get a lot of love and attention, but I gotta tell you, they're great buckets of goodness. So what are static lists? Lists in Pardot, we call them static because you have to manually add people to them, manually remove people from them. So how would you add someone to a static list? Well, when you first originally upload them, you can then say, put them on this list. So you're, again, manually doing that. You could also write an automation rule to say, if this person meets this criteria, add them to this list. But note, if you do that and you ever want to remove them, you have to make a separate automation rule to say, well, if this criteria ever changes or if new criteria happens, remove them from this list. So that's a little bit of work there to add or remove people. It'd be better to use a dynamic list in that situation. But there are specific uses of static lists. First of all, third-party event attendees. Not necessarily your own events. If you've got a connector to one of the event tools in Pardot, oftentimes a dynamic list works great there because you're looking for a criteria in their profile. Hey, did this criteria change? Great, add them to the list. Otherwise, if you go into Dreamforce and you're going to have a booth and you're going to get a bunch of badge scans or any kind of event that you may do, and you get a list in Excel and it says, here's the 300 people you met at this event, that's a great use for uploading into Pardot as event attendees. It's static, it's not going to change, and there's no real need for it to change because the people you met are the people you met, and there's no need for it to change, right? So perfect use for that. Email preference centers. How many people have an email preference center set up in Pardot? Go ahead, say if you've got one, or if you've been kind of eyeing that or thinking about it. Email preference centers are fantastic. Fantastic. If you've got one in chat, you can even link to it. They're really cool. And what I do, I have a picture of one over here on the right-hand side. This is actually the Cheshire Impact email preference center, or one of the Impact preference center. That's like a long word. They shorten it by calling it an EPC, email preference center. So you can call it an EPC. I'll call it that from now on too, so I don't get super tongue-tied on a webinar in front of like thousands of people. So EPC, they're fantastic. And when you think about deliverability of emails, Pardot makes you link to the one-click unsubscribe or to an email preference center. So you can actually delete the one-click unsubscribe and only link people at the bottom of a Pardot email to an email preference center, to an EPC. And by doing that, what you'll find, this is super counterintuitive, you'll find that people actually tend to subscribe more than they unsubscribe. So maybe they don't want your promotions fodder if you're sending too much spam, but maybe you want to get some of their thought announcements. Look over here at our EPC. Let's say we sent you a promotion, we offered you some deal on some brand new templates, ring in the new year with some new Pardot templates. We'll help create you some new ones. Wouldn't that be fancy? Wouldn't that be nice, right? That's how we sent you that out for fun at the end of the year. And you're like, Josh, stop sending me this spam. Now, you wouldn't say that to me, to us, of course, but let's say some other person did that. Well, you'd go to their EPC and look at what you'd see. You'd say, well, I don't want to be on their promotions list here, so I'm going to unclick that. But you know what? I would still like to get their monthly newsletter. because it tells me about really cool webinars like this one. So in that situation, I'm gonna actually subscribe. And we've done some testing on this. We've actually found linking to the EPC can actually boost subscriptions to other lists. And it also drops the number of people that totally opt out. You can still totally opt out. You click that link down there and you click, and then you're completely off our list on Pardot. And I will cry because that would be horrible. So to avoid that from people you really want to talk to, you create this EPC. And what you'll see here is all these different cool lists you can get on. Man, how many people want to get on this thing? This sounds pretty cool, right? Click. Now you're on a bunch of other lists. And so it's just a fantastic thing to do. But guess what? Each line here, each one of these things are Pardot lists, static lists. Why? Because someone is manually adding and removing themselves from it. So because of that mechanism, it needs to be a static list. So it's a static list for us inside of Pardot, and we've actually exposed it here to be able to say, put this on the EPC. Now, kind of a quick power tip for everyone, you can actually have separate EPCs depending on the type of person you're emailing. Like for us, we have partners, but we also have customers and marketers we're working with. So our partners actually get a separate EPC than our marketers do. So that way we can, again, looking specific to the audience. So just like the emails can be separate, the EPCs can be separate, and people feel like they're really being spoken to in a way that resonates with them. So EPCs are fantastic. Another good use of static lists are exposing those lists to the CRM, allowing sales to modify a list that someone's on. Now, you don't want to do this, you don't want to give them too much power here on the sales side. So not every single Pardot list or even a static list is exposed inside of Salesforce, but you can pick and choose which ones do. And a good use of that, or a good case study for that, would be if you have a particular nurture campaign you want to add people to, or if you want to have someone get an automated email saying, I'd love to schedule some time with you. Sales is going to send the same email every time. You can help them out by building a one email drip campaign that sends out this email and it has all their information in it, right? So there's different things you can do. Or if someone wants to RSVP for a list, you can have them go there. Or if you want to allow sales to add someone to the marketing blog subscription, you can have the sales be able to do it inside of Salesforce. So the final part really is anything you plan to be able to manually update, whether marketing's doing it or sales is doing it, for whatever case, a human is going to be changing it. You want to make that a static list. Can you manually unsubscribe a dynamic list? Yes, you can, but then it gets really weird. So you want to sort of keep that separate. We'll talk about dynamic lists next, but if it's something that you're going to manually add someone to or remove someone to, make it a static list so that it's very clear the mechanism of how it gets populated. Next up, we have my favorite, the dynamic list, the smart list of wonder. So what are these things? In Pardot, when you go to list creation, you want to create a new list. There's a little checkbox next to this thing that says, do you want to make this a dynamic list? And if you do, click on that thing. You'll see over here on the right-hand side, this is what you'll see next. You'll see dynamic list rules. And in Pardot, you'll see this interesting pattern. You'll see it on automation rules. You'll see it on emails, all these different kind of things. You'll have rule and action, rule and action. So rule is like the if question. If this, and the action is then do this. So in this particular case, it's just the if. So dynamic list rules. We're saying people that match this. And they can match all of it. They can match any of it. You can design it however you like. But in the example I gave you here, let's say I want to send an email out to people that are still working on some of the lower, more foundational elements of Pardot. It's something specific to where they're at with what they're doing with marketing automation. If their score, and you can see here, if their CSI score, and again, we track it. We're going to track it for you because we want to make sure that thing increases. If their score is between 0 and 2, let's send them a particular email, or maybe let's create a segment just for them. Maybe a series of drip campaigns just for them to help get them to CSI 3 so we can graduate them to the next step and give them some more information on some of those other cool features in Pardot, right? So this is just one way of doing it. It can also be, if these people are marketers and they're in North America and they are current customers, right? So you'd now have an active list of current marketing customers in North America. And the interesting thing about dynamic lists, and most of you probably already know this already, it'll automatically add people and remove people from the list based on what you've put here. So this CSI example is a great example. Let's say their CSI score for marketing automation is a 1. You know, by the way, to do the CSI, just write CSI in the chat and we'll follow up with you to make sure we schedule some time to do one. It's free, not selling us. We just need you to know your number so you can improve it. So you got your CSI score and then it's say 1, but then you work really hard and you build a bunch of good stuff and then your account really starts singing. We're gonna do the CSI again later on together and we find out, oh look, it's improved even more. So now you're a 4. Well, guess what? You might have fit this dynamic list initially, but because now your score is 4, you'll automatically get pulled off the list. It's really cool that it works both ways because it saves you from creating 2 separate automation rules. Now note, even if you did create 2 separate automation rules with a static list, those typically only work once unless you mess with that. So people get put on and people get pulled off. It's like, okay, one or the other. Dynamic lists will constantly work. So let's say, now CSI score is not going to go down. That would be terrible. I've never seen it happen. It's a climb up a mountain. We don't need to go down the mountain yet. But let's say someone, they had an open opportunity. Okay, great. Well, maybe we want to pull them off the general drip campaign so sales can focus on them. But let's say it's close lost. Oh, that's sad. Now they're back on our drip. But let's say that's done and there's a new opportunity. Okay, let's put them back on the list, right? So this thing can constantly add, subtract, move things around, and you never have to mess with it again. If you can create more dynamic lists, that's the goal. Static lists are good to start with, but really what you should be emailing are your dynamic lists. So, okay, let me pull up all of my certain customers in this industry or persona B, this particular persona. Let me go ahead and pull up that dynamic list in Pardot and email to all of them. So great uses of this is those regular go-to campaigns you have, your monthly campaigns. Power tip in your dynamic list, you can also have negative criteria. So I want to make sure that the person fits all this criteria and does not fit this other criteria. So you can use that and have your exclusion list. You can have your suppression list built right into your dynamic list. And by doing that, it simplifies it for you. You don't have to remember to add the suppression list. It's already subtracted from the list. So there's all sorts of cool hacks you can do with dynamic lists. Just make your job easy, okay? It's that time of the month. Let's go ahead and send out a marketing campaign to this particular, our top 2 segments maybe from earlier. Great, we're gonna send the thing out, boom. The list will constantly be updated with all the people you add to it, so you don't have to worry about it. Finally, nurture campaigns. In Pardot, nurture campaigns function off of lists. And so the coolest thing you can do is then make that a dynamic list that's associated with your nurture campaigns. So you don't have to manually add anybody to a list ever again, right? That's the goal, is you set up the criteria and you can have multiple parts of it. But once you know, okay, they're this persona, they're this industry, or they're this role, whatever kind of categorization you want to do, they're automatically on this list and they're automatically going to receive this nurture campaign. And if anything ever changes, they'll get pulled off of it. But if they ever change back to what we want them to be, they'll continue receiving the emails from wherever the point they were at when they left. So it's a really cool condition to be able to use that. All right. Finally, the segmentation rule. Has anyone ever used the segmentation rule? You could raise your hand, you could say yes, you could say no in the GoToMeeting chat. All right. So, not yet. Well, here's the deal. Segmentation rules, I called them the third cousin lists because, well, they don't tend to get used very often. Oh, Mark, you built one yesterday. Fantastic. How are your cousins doing? That's great. Hope they had a good time. This is like that family photo and you're like, wait, who is that guy? Or who is that gal? Oh, that's your third cousin. And you like never really, your first cousins are maybe, but third cousins are like, I don't even know who that is. Well, it's one of those things that not used very often, but it doesn't mean it's not necessarily doesn't have a good fit. So the important thing here is that it's a one-time snapshot. So they meet the criteria, the same kind of criteria we set up for the dynamic list. It would be one of those things where instead of dynamically setting it up, it happens one time. So think of it as that family photo, right? We're all sitting down. Okay, who's in our family right now? 1776, here's our family. So a good way of doing this is, you can see some of the criteria over here. If I'm saying, okay, show me all the people, in this example right here, Boston World Tour. The World Tour is coming to Boston in September 2019. I made that up, by the way. I'm not really sure if it is. But let's say that's a particular example. They're coming, and we want to know who is on our database right now that's in the greater Boston area that could come meet us at the event. And let's say they meet certain criteria. You can put a bunch of stuff in there. Go ahead and hit run. It runs once, and it shows us all the people that meet that criteria. You can use it to email. You can use it to do all sorts of things. Just know it'll never run again. Unlike a dynamic list, which will add people, remove people, constantly stay up to date, this is immediately, I don't say out of date, but it's immediately out of date as soon as you run it. Because if anything ever changes the moment after you ran the list, then that's not going to get picked up on here. So uses, I don't even put great uses, but one of the uses for this can be like a one-time campaign. Show me people that fit this criteria right now and that I want to come back to and see, right? So you can always in Pardot go back and see who you sent an email to. Well, you could also run a segmentation rule, and it'll never change. So you could say, who did I email last year at the same time? And the dynamic list wouldn't show you that because it's constantly changing and modifying and adding people if they meet the new criteria. So again, it's a snapshot in time if you want to see that family photo from a certain period of time. Yeah, good point, Jay. Northeast Dreaming. Hello. Yeah, I would definitely make a segmentation rule for Northeast Dreaming. Be like, who wants to party at Northeast Dreaming in September? That'd be a great use for that. All right, we have a winner. You want a new car. All right, let's close this thing out. Let's talk about the sources. If you haven't already heard about the Hardcore Marketing Show, highly recommend you check it out. It's just basically me interviewing the smartest people in the world on every single one of these CSI topics. And I thought I knew a bunch, and then I interviewed these amazing people. We've had over 80 shows at this point, and I've constantly learned. So if you think I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm constantly learning, totally. That's the kind of conversations we're having and the people we're having on here. So give a listen to it. It is on YouTube. If you're a YouTube fan, it's also on iTunes podcast. And if you've never listened to a podcast, I'd say check this one out. It might be the thing that gets you into podcasts. But if you are into podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, it's on all those things. Just look for Hardcore Marketing. Now, you have to spell core like the Marine Corps, though. You can't spell like the Earth Core, because then iTunes will be like, I don't know what you're talking about. So Adele Ravella, highly recommend you check that one out. I can't believe I talked to her on my 3rd episode. She literally wrote the book Buyer Personas. So, we could talk about it for a little bit here, like an hour-long webinar. But man, she dives into it. And on this particular podcast, she actually does a buyer persona interview of me. So I'm the buyer, and she's interviewing me about why I bought marketing automation, why I bought Pardot, what was the process I was going through. And you can actually hear her asking the question and the follow-on question on all these different stages and stops. It's like literally like a lab in how to do a buyer persona phone call with someone. So highly recommend you check that one out. Parmalee, Ellen, fantastic. They talk about win-loss. And that's the idea of not only talking about the people that did buy your product or service, but also people that didn't, and asking them. And both of them, actually, you can hire them to teach you how to do that, or even to do it for you, which I think is fantastic, because sometimes they'll get that kind of third-party information that people may not be ready to share with you directly. So fantastic. All right, next steps. Let's do Q&A after that. Check out the Hardcore Marketing Show. Check out Adele's episode. Susan's, obviously, her episode is number 25. As well, get your CSI score. We have a bunch of templates, a bunch of worksheets, some things to help you get an index of all your lists and figure things out, because what comes after lists is figuring out, do I have the fields to track them, right? So you need all those things mapped out. We've got some cool templates for you. You just need to know where you're at. And once you have your CSI score, it all can come from there. So if you don't have your CSI score, throw that in the webinar chat or in the question interface. Just say CSI, and we'll make sure we get you scheduled up to do one of those. Okay, Cheshire Impact. If you don't know who we are, hello, nice to meet you. We do Pardot. We do Salesforce. I think that's one of the biggest things I could also share with you. We do Salesforce. So if you happen to be, doing your Pardot thing and you could use some backup, some support, and some creation, some work done on the Salesforce side, hit us up. And we also have a CSI for Salesforce too. And can help you with the workshops, the campaign execution. There's also a book coming out. Instead, it's not actually Q1. It's going to be coming out sooner than that. So it'll be coming out within a couple months. And we'll make sure you guys can get copies of that. It's all about the CSI topics. All right, Q&A. Let's talk.